Intuition is the conscious experience in pure spirit of a purely spiritual content. Rudolf Steiner. This is going to be by far the most difficult thing that I have ever attempted to explain here. I began this channel with a discussion of Jean Gebser's ever-present origin, and a series of videos covering the first 3 structures of consciousness which Gebser outlined in his text. Yet after addressing mythical consciousness, I put that series on hold. I knew that actually tackling what Gebser termed the integral consciousness structure would be a monumental task, and something which would require an enormous amount of prologue. Integrality is something that cannot be condensed into a catchphrase, although certainly there have been those who have attempted to do so. The integral structure is, in essence, the convergence point of absolutely everything that we have discussed on this channel thus far. To understand the integral structure is to understand a form of consciousness which has been coming to unfold over the course of the past 2.5 centuries, and which has been germinating for the entirety of human history. It is to understand a complete reconceptualizing of truth, time, causality, being, history, and consciousness. All of the rivers of the unfolding of human thought converge upon the vast, sublime ocean that is the integral structure. It is the past, the present, the future, the light, and the darkness. And yet, I am also an extremely hard-headed person, and as such, I am either going to manage to explain integral consciousness clearly and effectively, or I am going to die trying. Now, without any further ado, we are going to set ourselves upon the mountain which towers before us. But first, I want us to briefly recap the picture that Gebser illustrates in the first half of the ever-present origin. Gebser's work depicts a history of human consciousness which consists of the development of 5 distinct structures which have been built upon and within one another over the course of human history. These are the archaic structure, the magical structure, the mythical structure, the mental structure, and the integral structure. Each of these structures represents a completely distinct mode of consciousness, with a unique manner of relating to the world. Each subsequent structure is preconditioned by the previous structure, and comes to grow within the foundations developed by the previous structure. The dominant structure of any given phase of human consciousness is essentially the outermost layer of a complex architecture of thought, awareness, and meanings. Moreover, this succession of consciousness structures represents the unfolding of novel dimensionalities of consciousness. So here we need to take note of what exactly this notion of dimensionality implies here. A dimension is a domain of possible relationships. A straight line is one-dimensional. I can place any number of points on the line, but ultimately the relationships between those points can be expressed as a single variable, a single measure of length. If I add a second line, I can create a second axis and thereby create a domain with 2 dimensions. The points within this domain relate to each other in 2 different ways. Their coordination is expressed in terms of an x-axis and a y-axis. There are thus 2 different forms of relationality which can be expressed within this 2-dimensional domain. With lines and planes, the relevant relationality is that of distance, spatial relationships. With the structures of human consciousness, however, each dimension of consciousness is a domain within which different objects of consciousness can be related to one another in a more basic manner. The magical structure is one-dimensional in the sense that its primary mode of relationship is that of unity. Magical thought pertains to relationships of resonance and synchronicity. We see this mode of awareness expressed in magical practices such as magical paintings. A cave painting of a buffalo being killed with an arrow, for example, should not be understood as a representation of an event which has previously occurred, or even as a representation of a possible event. The magical modality is that of unity, and thus there is no such possibility of separating form and actuality in such a manner. Rather, the painting simply is the killing of the buffalo. The act and the painting are separate instances of the same underlying unity. The painting and the physical act itself are understood to be of the same essence. They are of the same spirit, and magical thinking understands the world as spirit. To slay the buffalo on the cave wall is to slay the buffalo on the plains. The relationship between the two instances is not one of representation, but rather of resonance. All magical practices operate in this manner. All are understood to be participations in the spiritual constitution of a fundamentally undivided reality. Within mythical consciousness, we have the introduction of a second dimension and the polar modality of consciousness. Mythical awareness understands the world in terms of polar oppositions: earth and sky, yin and yang, spirit and soul, life and death, masculine and feminine, all complementary of one another. The fundamental symbolic representation of this mode of thinking is the circle or mandala. The two endpoints of the line come to loop back around upon one another like an Ouroboros, depicting the unity of opposites. Oppositions within mythical thinking are always necessarily codependent upon one another and complementary. Mythical thinking thus understands the world in terms of balance. Within mental consciousness, we see the emergence of the third dimension, that of negation and thus contradiction, within which the possibility of triadic modes of thought comes to emerge. We can see this dynamic expressed most succinctly within logical thought. Exclusivity is absolutely fundamental to any kind of logical operation. If a logician allows for a contradiction within his system of logic, then the whole edifice simply stops working. If you allow for the truth of a contradiction, then you can use that contradiction to prove anything, and thus the entire system ceases to function in any meaningful manner. Logic thus requires the mutual negation of oppositions. This is a mode of duality in contrast to the mythical mode of polarity, within which opposites are able to coexist with one another. Making use of such negational thought, the mental structure thus allows for modes of thought such as the syllogism, two premises which entail a certain conclusion, the basic triad of mental thought. This triadic mode of consciousness then allows for the possibility of geometry, which itself preconditions the possibility of Cartesian coordination, and thus the possibility of understanding spatiality and perspectivity. Each structure of consciousness can then be subdivided into two modes: an efficient mode and a deficient mode. Within the efficient mode of a given structure, the dominant structure remains situated within the effective processes of the previous structures which it has developed out of. If we look to Platonic thought, for example, we see a mode of consciousness in which the mental structure is dominant, but within which mythical and magical consciousness remain very much active, incorporated into the manifold which has come to be developed by the mental structure. We see this efficient mode of mental consciousness all the way through the classical and medieval periods up to the early modern period. Isaac Newton, for example, was a very mental thinker, but one who was just as interested in the mythical and magical practices of alchemy as he was in the mental practices of mechanistic science. Within Newton's world, the mental structure had yet to begin negating the structures of awareness which underpinned it. Within the deficient mode, however, a dominant consciousness structure comes to be untethered from the ground which it resides upon, and thus comes to occlude the previous structures of consciousness. The deficient mode of the mental structure came to dominate during the 19th and 20th centuries. The mental structure came to outshine all other structures of consciousness, and as such, those previous structures of consciousness came to operate beneath the conscious awareness of many people. The archaic, magical, and mythical structures remained very much in play, but within modernist thought, the mental structure became unable to understand the structures of meaning which conditioned its own existence. Yet it is this very deficiency which then comes to necessitate the emergence of subsequent structures of consciousness. We can see how this plays out in the emergence of mental consciousness from the deficient mythical structure. Mythical consciousness is polarity, and as mythical consciousness becomes deficient, it loses contact with the mode of unity, which is the magical structure. As this occurs, mythical polarities come to bifurcate, thus resulting in an imbalance between the two poles. Efficient mythical awareness can see the underlying unity of transcendence and immanence, or of life and death, or of light and darkness. Yet, once the mythical comes to lose contact with its magical foundations, these polarities come to rupture apart from one another, such that one valence of the polarities is seen as dominant and the other as subordinate to it. Darkness comes to be seen as the mere absence of light. Chaos comes to be seen as the mere negation of order. Death comes to be seen as the mere lack of life. As such, we see that within deficient mythical consciousness, there emerges a self-negation of codependent polar oppositions. This negation then allows for the possibility of dualistic consciousness, and thus for the realization of the mental consciousness structure. Mental consciousness comes to be necessitated by the development of independence achieved by the mythical structure. Similarly, then, the deficiency of the mental structure within our own historical epoch is that which has necessitated the ongoing emergence of what Gebser terms the integral structure of human consciousness. One of the most central developments which Gebser sees in this process is the development of perspective within the mental structure. When we look to ancient forms of art, we see a conspicuous absence of perspectivity. We see that human consciousness had yet to develop the sense that the world could be seen as a kind of space which radiates outward from a central point which corresponds to the human self. In literature, likewise, we find nothing which could correspond to what we might understand as a first-person point of view on the world. It isn't until the Italian Renaissance that we first begin to see clear indications of perspective in human consciousness. In visual art, we see this as a mode of framing, in which the art is set forth explicitly in relation to an imagined point of view to then be occupied by the viewer of the art. The Mona Lisa is looking at us through an implied space which separates us from her. She is framed as she would appear from the perspective of someone standing directly in front of her. It is really worth taking in just how immensely radical this frame shift actually is. The very idea that art could depict a particular frame of reference, a particular point of view from which the world comes to manifest in a particular way, is a notion which is so familiar to us in the modern world that it is almost difficult to even put it into words. It is an idea which seems to us to simply be a given, and yet this mode of consciousness is in fact a very recent historical development. Perspectivity requires that human consciousness be able to see the world as it is for a particular imaginary point which we associate with the human self. This is a mode of awareness which was simply unavailable to the magical, mythical, and early mental structures of consciousness, as it is a mode of awareness which requires that we be able to regard the field of awareness of an individual human being as though it were something distinct from the world which the human being is continuous with. It further requires us to see that the way in which the world comes to presence can be relative between individuals. We can no longer assume that we are simply seeing the world as it is, but rather we must understand our own position and imaginary positions of other human beings, and thus understand how such perspective conditions the manifestation of reality. This play of imagination, which allows for perspectival thought, is far from a given, yet we can see how this modality is conditioned by the architecture of the mental consciousness structure. While magical consciousness is a mode of essential unity, and the mythical structure is a mode of continuous polarity, the mental structure is a mode of diametric opposition and negation. As such, the mental structure is able to conceptualize the human self as the negation of the world it inhabits, and vice versa. But this selfhood is relative to particular individuals. Selfhood in relation to me is a mode which then frames all other individual human selves as other, as part of the world which is a not I. Because this frame is dependent upon the particular I in question, this allows for the frame to be relativized in accordance with distinct human selves. There is the world in relation to me, which includes you, but not me. And then there is the world in relation to you, which includes me, but not you. This development of perspectivity can then be seen as continuous with a much larger process by which the human sense of selfhood has come to gradually contract over the course of human history. Gebser understands this process as being one by which human consciousness gradually develops the capacity for an awareness of both soul and time. As we see within the ever-present origin, soul awareness and time awareness are in fact inextricably linked and coextensive with one another. Within the magical structure, there is no sense of self as something distinct from the familial and tribal relationships which condition it. A human self is nothing at all insofar as it is abstracted away from those collective relationships which it is inextricably a part of. Magical awareness is the monodimensional awareness of spirit as that which is manifest. That is to say that magical consciousness does not distinguish a transcendental realm from immanent actuality. That which comes to presence within consciousness is understood to be spirit, and there is no understanding of a trans-temporal world of forms, or a heavenly realm, which is juxtaposed with nature itself. The natural world is understood to be the spirit world. The gods and ancestors are felt to be among the living, rather than seen to be in a transcendental realm beyond nature. Within the mythical structure, this unity of self and world then comes to develop into a polarity of soul and spirit. Mythical consciousness divides the world into the domains of heaven and earth, the celestial and the chthonic. In doing so, mythical consciousness is then able to see the transcendental aspect of human self-identity, which contrasts with the lived actuality of the immanent realm. While blood is seen magically as the life forces of nature which animate the human body, the mythical structure comes to see breath as the animation of the immanent body by the transcendent personality, the individual soul. As mythical consciousness came to understand the soul, it likewise came to see time as that which contrasts with the transcendental realm of gods and forms, which was understood to be beyond time. Thus, time comes to emerge within mythical awareness as the imperfect and contingent realm of becoming, which stands in opposition to the perfect and necessary realm of pure being. The collective, immanent soul of the magical tribe comes to be augmented by an understanding of the form of the individual personality. The self becomes understood as a universal, and this universality is then followed by an equal but opposite contraction of the human sense of being. The I comes to be felt as something which exists distinctly from, yet codependently with, the body and the life forces which connect the body to other human beings and to nature itself. This is the exact same motion which we saw in our previous discussion of the axial age, within which the mythical understanding of the human self as pure, universal consciousness came to be predominant over the magical understanding of the self as embodied life forces. This universalization of the particularity of human existence would then come to culminate in the paradoxical narrative of the life of Christ. The ultimate universality of God and the ultimate particularity of human life came to unify within a singular event which ruptured the boundaries of life and death, body and soul, transcendence and immanence. Over the course of the subsequent centuries, this universalization of the particular would come to further develop into modern perspectivity, the first-person self-awareness within which the universality of the world comes to be framed by the particularity of the individual self within a particular frame of reference. Within perspectival consciousness, it is not only that the I comes to transcend one's bodily existence, but moreover that the world comes to be relativized in relation to the I, as that which is framed by it. As with so many other magical properties of language, the homophony of the capital I and I, is synchronic, not coincidental. It is a resonance which speaks to deeper forces at work which continue to shape the evolution of human awareness. As the mental structure comes to be deficient and thus loses connection with its mythical ground, the self comes to be understood as the negation of other, rather than as its polar complement. The unity of self-other within the realm of spirit gives way to the duality of self-other within the realm of ego-awareness. Detached from spirit, the transcendental soul of the individual human personality, therefore, ultimately comes to mutate into the perspectival ego. This reification of perspective to the level of the transcendental is precisely what we see expressed within the metaphysics of René Descartes. René Descartes begins with absolute doubt, and then grounds his metaphysics within the cogito ergo sum, the I think, therefore I am. The I am which Descartes arrives at is therefore the locus of doubt itself. Descartes doubts all that can be doubted until there is nothing left to doubt, and in doing so, arrives at the I am. This I am is therefore not the totality of Descartes' being, but rather it is precisely the source of doubt, scrutiny, and paranoia. Descartes' I am is therefore the replacement of the transcendental soul and immanent spirit by the perspectival ego. In correspondence with this contraction of the Cartesian self, we see that Descartes' understanding of truth came to be reconstructed in relation to this reification of ego perspective. Descartes came to see truth as certainty, not as the reality of the world, but rather as the assuredness of the ego in relation to the world. Truth becomes understood as certainty, and thus becomes understood as the precision of predictive power. Truth, therefore, comes to be understood as that which allows the ego perspective to grasp the world, to control and master the world. Thus here we can see that the same transmutations of consciousness, which allowed for the possibility of the Mona Lisa to look us in the eye through her frame, are the same transmutations which allowed for the possibility of predictive mathematical science and machine technologies. Yet Descartes' own philosophy maintained at least one thread of connection, which continued to link it to its own magical and mythical underpinnings. Within Descartes' epistemological framework, it is God who serves to ensure that there remains a correspondence between the ego self and the world which it enframes. Descartes' God serves to ensure that there remains an isomorphism between the perspective of the ego and the reality of the world beyond the ego. Without that tether, the ego finds itself in a room of mirrors, unable to know whether the mirrors of the mind actually reflect the world outside or if they are instead only illusions. We can see the ultimate fate of the Cartesian ego within the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. In essence, Nietzsche's philosophy can be seen as following through on all of the implications which were developed within Descartes' philosophy. Nietzsche came to explicitly understand truth and valuation as power, and came to understand power as that which is projected from the ego perspective onto the world. Within Descartes' philosophy, God served as a kind of bridge which allows for the meeting of the immanent and the transcendent, the ego and the world beyond it. Thus the world and self are able to remain in a kind of polar mythical balance beneath the doubt and scrutiny of the rational mind. Within Nietzsche's philosophy, this mythical polarity comes to fully collapse into a dialectic of mental negation, self and world, immanence and transcendence come into a kind of battle to the death within Nietzsche's metaphysics, and ultimately it was the immanent, perspectival ego self which Nietzsche saw as the center of all reality. Everything else came to be seen as a mere projection of the ego self and its will to secure, control, master, and dominate. Nietzsche's life and philosophy thus encapsulated what Goethe saw as the deficient mode of the integral structure, a kind of dissolutive relativism in which perspectivity comes to annihilate the reality of the world. It is this ultimate relativization, which in popular culture is often referred to as postmodernism. Truth becomes seen as merely a matter of perspective and power. The world seems to thus dissolve into an insubstantial, vaporous nothingness, as we come to feel that there is really nothing beyond the solipsism of the ego perspective. Within this inward collapse of perspectivity, we see, along with this reconceptualization of human selfhood, a correlative reconceptualization of time. As we have seen, the perspectival ego self preconditioned the possibility of understanding space as that which issues forth from a particular perspective, as the horizon of a given perspective. As this perspectivity comes to be absolutized, time comes to collapse into space, and this is precisely what we see within Einstein's theory of general relativity. Einstein relativized time and space in such a manner that time was seen as being a kind of fourth spatial dimension. Moreover, this relativization was itself fundamentally perspectival. Time and space both became relative to particular perspectives without there being any underlying constancy to either space or time, which such relativized spacetime could be measured against. Within this framework, any two events can be understood as simultaneous from a certain perspective. There is no privileged perspective within this framework, and as such, there is no absolute truth regarding whether or not any two events are actually simultaneous or not. Within the metaphysical scheme implied by Einstein's theory, time itself thus comes to be understood as a kind of illusion, which is only meaningful in regards to a particular perspective. If we step outside of such perspectives, the very notions of space and time break down, and it seems as though the entire history of the universe were, in effect, all happening at once within what is often referred to as a block universe. Within this cosmology, everything that has ever happened or will ever happen exists all at once within this singular, eternal block. If we look at Einstein's theory within the context of the evolution of consciousness, what we see is a collapse of time into space, which corresponds to the Nietzschean collapse of perspectivity into itself. The perfect metaphor for this deficient hyper-perspectival consciousness is, appropriately enough, the black hole, a hypothesized astronomical object in which both space and time cease to have any real meaning as they are devoured by the object's central singularity. Even more appropriately, it has been theorized that such black holes come into being through the death of supermassive stars. Stars which, like our own sun, signify the soul. Yet, simultaneously, it is this perspectivity which Goethe saw as necessitating the aperspectival, what we might otherwise refer to as meta-perspectival consciousness, the core of the fifth, integral structure of human awareness and the climax of all human history hitherto. In order to illustrate the manner by which perspectival consciousness comes to give way unto aperspectival consciousness, we will now turn to one of the most monumental figures in recent philosophical history, Martin Heidegger. The metamorphic trajectory of Heidegger's thought throughout his lifetime is an immense subject unto itself, one which extends far beyond the scope of our present purposes, but for now I would like us to begin by looking at Heidegger's relationship with Friedrich Nietzsche. Heidegger saw Nietzsche's philosophy as the culmination, consummation, or fulfillment of a narrative which lay at the core of Western metaphysics as a whole. And thus, by looking at Nietzsche through Heidegger, we can contextualize how Heidegger saw his own metaphysics to be situated within the grandest scope of history. Heidegger saw the core of Nietzsche's metaphysics as being the will to power, and moreover, understood that the will to power itself implicated a very specific understanding of the human self which Nietzsche had inherited from Descartes. Heidegger saw these transformations of philosophy as instantiations of a broader history of being itself, a history of how human beings came to relate to being itself, and thus how being came to manifest within the context of human experience. Heidegger saw the core of metaphysics as fundamental ontology, the manner by which being itself was conceptualized in relation to human existence. Heidegger tells us that within Descartes' metaphysical scheme, we see the fundamental ground of being come to shift. Within the pre-Cartesian Western world, the fundamental ground of being, or hypokaimenon, was understood as the Platonic One, or as God. The being of all other beings was understood in relation to the One, or to God, what one could understand as the ultimate core of existence itself. Within Descartes, we see this conception come to shift, such that now it is in fact the human ego perspective which comes to be understood as the hypokaimenon, the ground of being. Through Descartes' systematic doubt, all truth came to be understood in relation to the certainty of the ego perspective. The reality of the world itself thus came to be grounded within the doubt or certainty of the ego perspective. In a very real sense, the human ego came to occupy the metaphysical position which was once reserved for God. This subjectivization of being itself thus conditioned the inevitable development of Nietzsche's metaphysics of power. All things came to be understood as being only real or true or valuable, insofar as they related to the will to power of the individual ego. Within Nietzsche's thought, we see that being itself comes to be reduced to that which is revealed through such relations of power. Moreover, Heidegger saw that there was an intimate relationship between this Nietzschean power and Cartesian skepticism. Nietzsche understood power as that which allowed for the furthering, growth, and continuation of willing power itself. Power is thus understood to be that which grasps or secures the world, such that the ego can secure itself. The will to power is in fact a will to self-securing, self-preserving power. It is the will to achieve control over the world through coercive dominance or through predictive certainty. Heidegger saw that the unfolding of Nietzschean power from Cartesian skepticism was a window into an even deeper process which was at work within Western metaphysics: the erasure of being itself through the reification of human metaphysical frameworks. As this inner logic of subordinating being to human perspective came to unfold, the world came to be seen as a mere standing reserve of resources to be extracted or obstacles to be surmounted. Western thought had come to de-animate the world through its attempt to control nature, and through this process we had come to be ever further removed from the reality of being. So what then is the reality of being? In order to understand how Heidegger saw being, we must understand that he saw metaphysics in a phenomenological manner. Kant had come to see that the human mind structures our experience of reality, and had therefore concluded that we are only ever able to encounter the phenomenal world. The thing in itself was ever hidden from us, ever beyond our reach. Heidegger, however, did not see being as something which lay inextricably beyond our perceptions of the world, but rather as that which is revealed or disclosed through our relationships with the world. Unlike Kant, Heidegger also saw that the conditioning of this revealing of being was something which was not simply fixed by universal structures of the human psyche. Rather, Heidegger saw that the particular mode of disclosure through which the world came to be present for us was relative to forms of life through which human beings and nature came to be co-participants within one another. Metaphysics, then, was for Heidegger not merely a kind of philosophical theory, but rather Heidegger saw metaphysics as the core of the human life world. The fundamental ontology of a given metaphysical paradigm is thus a kind of seed from which the entirety of a human mode of life comes to grow. It is this core which thus conditions the manner in which being comes to disclose itself within human experience. Metaphysics delineates the phenomenological horizon of a given phase of being. Throughout the history of Western metaphysics, and particularly through the metaphysical transformations which have characterized modernity, the phenomenological horizon of Western civilization has come to undergo an immense contraction, an extreme narrowing, such that we are now only able to experience being as that which is disclosed through the self-securing power of the human ego. If you are a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and within this metaphysical paradigm of inframing, all things come to appear as standing reserve, as machines, resources, and relations of control and manipulation. What Heidegger refers to simply as the danger lay in the manner by which this self-securing mode of metaphysics has come to obscure the reality of the world. Heidegger saw human experience through the ancient conception of aletheia, the unconcealment of that which was hidden, the disclosure of the potentialities latent within being. Yet Heidegger also spoke of what he called the concealed concealment within unconcealment, the manner by which our mode of revealing the world comes to conceal that which is not revealed, the shadows of the light which our consciousness casts upon the world. Every act of revealing is also an act of concealing, and this concealment too comes to be concealed. we become blind to certain valences of the world, and we become blind to that very blindness. Through this process, metaphysics has brought us to a historical situation within which we are unable to see the world at all, but rather only an abstract facsimile of the world which is inframed entirely by relations of control and mechanization. We lose sight of the world, and in doing so we also come to unravel the world through our comportment of securing power, and the metaphysical imperative of mechanical dominance. We come to unworld the world. Thus Heidegger saw that in order to move beyond this paradigm, Western metaphysics must come to loosen its grip upon being. In doing so, we find that being itself is in fact a kind of irreducible indeterminacy. As we have already noted, the manner by which being comes to manifest is conditioned by the human mode of relating to being. And this then implies that being itself is fundamentally multivalent. There is no particular mode of relation which discloses being in its totality, as being itself consists in the potentiality for such disclosure. Being itself, in its sheer indeterminacy, is thus ultimately inexhaustible. There is a kind of fluidity in the disclosure of being to human consciousness, and through moving beyond the metaphysics of enframing, will to power, and ego perspective, we can thus come to see that this multivalency of being is in fact fundamental to the aliveness of the world. There is a fundamental and necessary kind of abyssal darkness within being, which is inexhaustible and therefore indefinite in its potentiality. If we are able to open ourselves such that we can come to see this abyssal nature of being, we can see it in even the most seemingly mundane objects. If we look at something like a pencil and ask what its fundamental reality consists in, we might be tempted to describe it as a collection of atoms which are arranged in a certain manner. We think of the object's reality in terms of how precisely we can break it down, how we might carve up the world, as it were. Yet in this mode of perception, we must realize that we have abstracted the object from its actual situatedness within the context of the world. The pencil is only real insofar as it resides in relationality and potential relationality with all the other entities which inhabit the world. The pencil is more than what it is made up of, and it is even more than the particular relationships which have come to concretize within the object's history. Within the depths of the being of the humble pencil, we see a fathomless abyss consisting in all the possibilities which the pencil might come to participate in, and even what the pencil could have been in the past. Within the pencil is every possible way in which the pencil might come to disclose itself through its participation in the all-encompassing interrelatedness of the world. Within a block of marble is contained all possible marble statues, all possible experiences of looking at those statues, all possible emotions felt by those observers, every possible raindrop or current of light which might come to touch those surfaces, the organic creativity of nature, as so with the creativity of human organisms, always comes to draw upon that fathomless abyss of possibilities which resides within the dark ground of being. It is this creativity from darkness, which the writer and filmmaker Nora Bateson has dubbed Aphanipoiesis, in contrast to the autopoiesis of the biologist Francisco Varela, and the sympoiesis of philosopher Donna Haraway. To illustrate this mode of openness to being, which Heidegger attempts to inculcate, I will read a passage from his essay on the origin of the work of art, in which he provides a phenomenological description of an 1888 work of Van Gogh titled A Pair of Shoes. Quote, "From the dark opening of the worn insides of the shoes, the toilsome tread of the worker stares forth. In the stiffly rugged heaviness of the shoes, there is the accumulated tenacity of her slow trudge through the far-spreading and ever-uniform furrows of the field swept by a raw wind. On the leather lie the dampness and richness of the soil. Under the soles slides the loneliness of the field path as evening falls. In the shoes vibrates the silent call of the earth, its quiet gift of the ripening grain, and its unexplained self-refusal in the fallow desolation of the wintry field. This equipment is pervaded by uncomplaining anxiety as to the certainties of bread, the wordless joy of having once more withstood want, the trembling before the impending childbed, and shivering at the surrounding menace of death. This equipment belongs to the earth, and it is protected in the world of the peasant woman. From out of this protected belonging, the equipment itself rises to its resting within itself." End quote. Within Heidegger's conception of being, we can begin to see one manner in which the black hole of ego perspectivity comes to give way unto the aperspectival, within which human consciousness comes to see what Gebser referred to as the diaphaneity of the world. Within this mode of awareness, the world comes to be transparent, in that we are able to look through the particular manifestations of the world and into the indeterminate spaces of possibility which lie beyond that disclosure. Rather than concluding that we are locked into a particular ego perspective, or that there simply is no reality which lies beyond what our awareness presents to us, we can instead see that reality is that which is disclosed, and thus see the plenitude of such disclosure. We can then see, for example, that our particular manner of perceiving and relating to something is not exhaustive of that something. There is an infinity of other ways in which things could be disclosed, as the being which comes to be disclosed is in itself diaphanous. It is inextricably indefinite and indeterminate. And it is within that very indeterminacy that we find the fundamental freedom which resides within the heart of being itself. A freedom which will become much more clear as we move forward in this discussion. Though Gebser refers to Heidegger in many different ways within the pages of the Ever-Present Origin, Gebser tells us that the greatest expression within metaphysics of this emerging integral mode of awareness is to be found in the works of Alfred North Whitehead. As with Henri Bergson, Whitehead came to reject the Cartesian and Kantian divide of phenomena and noumena, mind and matter, between the world as it appears to us and the world as it is thought to exist independently of experience. Rather than conceptualizing nature as that which resides ever behind our experiences, and seeing our experiences as a kind of insurmountable screen which separates us from the world as it actually is, Whitehead instead came to conceptualize the fundamental constituents of the world as experiences. Whitehead saw nature as alive and saw the basic elements of nature as being self-organizing, organic, and experiential processes, through which potentialities came to concretize into definite actualities. Whitehead saw these basic units of reality as droplets of awareness, or electromagnetic occasions of experience, though he most often simply referred to them as actual entities. Each actual entity comes into being through what Whitehead calls concrescence, the concretization and coalescence of actuality. Within Whitehead's metaphysics, each actual entity is an event, which is comprised of both a physical and mental pole. Within the physical pole, an actual entity comes to inherit the determinations of previous events which have already concretized into a definite structure. The physical pole is the realm of what modern science would understand to be physical causation. Previous events condition the nature of subsequent events. The physical pole is defined by physical prehension, relationships by which the concrescence is shaped by the feeling of previous events which are in relation with it. This is the manner by which our sensory organs operate. You never actually sense the immediate present. Even the speed of light is finite, and as such, even your visual experience of the world consists of past actualities which have already become definitely structured. These past actualities feed into your own moments of experience, and thus come to change the concrescence of such moments. Within the mental pole, however, the actual event comes into relation not with past actualities, but rather with possibilities. The event experiences a field of potentialities which Whitehead refers to as eternal objects, or what we might also think of as being Platonic forms. These forms are the most basic structural components of reality, as they are what come to inform experiential organic events. These eternal objects are the means by which consciousness comes to collapse indeterminate possibility into concrete feelings. Whitehead's eternal objects can be thought of as specific possibilities of relationality, as different modes of process, which can be incorporated into a moment of concrescence so as to allow for the achievement of definition within that moment. The mental pole of such droplets of electromagnetic experience can thus be thought of as diffuse, diaphanous distributions of such possibilities, like a composite image consisting of all the potentials which are available to the experience within a given moment of concrescence. This is a conceptual scheme which encompasses electromagnetic fields and electron orbital shells in the exact same manner that it encompasses the distributions of possible behaviors available to biological organisms. The experiential event comes to freely evaluate such possibilities so as to determine the actual structure of potentialities which comes to be incorporated into itself. The mental pole of consciousness can thus be understood as feeling its way through a space of pure forms, with its decisions then coming to be concretized as definite moments of reality. Thus, when we sense the world from our individual ego perspectives, we see the world only as it has come to concretize in relation to our own perspectives, but we are also able to look with our minds as well as with our eyes. In doing so, we can come to see possibility spaces, which constitute the mental poles of the actual entities in the world around us. We can begin to see the fields of consciousness, the auras, if you will, which envelop and ultimately produce the actualities which become present before us. We come to experience not only the possibilities which are available to our own droplets of experience, but we further can come to see the possibilities which are available within the world at large. Within both Heidegger and Whitehead, we see an intimation of what Goethe saw as the unfolding of a novel dimension of human consciousness. The capacity to see the diffusion of possibilities which underlies that which comes to manifest as the concrete world which is available to our sensory perceptions. Heidegger and Whitehead both seem to suggest the possibility that we might see through what is present to the sensory perceptions of our particular perspectives, and into the radiating auras of potentiality which collapse into such definiteness. We come to be able to see that our own perspectives are indeed limited and do not reveal the fullness of the possibilities which reside within the world. We come to move beyond the confines of our own perspectives such that we can experience the world from a plurality of possible perspectives. This is not a mere relativism, but rather a kind of experiential syncretism, in which one is able to experience a range of possible relationships which might come to define the constitution of the world. Our consciousness thus comes to open up a space within which we can find the manifestation of that which was hidden by the limitations of our own perspective. This is not to say that such integral awareness is akin to a God's eye view of the world, or a capacity to see the objectivity which supposedly lies beyond all possible experiences. Rather, it is an awareness which experiences the inexhaustible indeterminacy of being in such a manner that we are able to broaden our awareness, and thus come to perceive that which was hidden by sensory experiences. Within such integral consciousness, we come to experience time in a very different manner than what had been available to any of the previous consciousness structures. Goethe tells us that magical consciousness was itself pretemporal. As magical consciousness did not distinguish between nature and a transcendental realm beyond nature, magical awareness saw all events as being, in a sense, eternal events. The past was never felt to be gone, or even to be truly distinct from the present or future. All of reality within the magical structure is experienced as being timeless. Within the mythical structure, time comes to be understood in terms of recurrent cyclicity, and the dialectic polarity of the eternal and the temporal. The eternal stands over and above time, and nature is understood to be beholden to the fate dictated to it by the eternal realm. Mythical consciousness was able to perceive the world of forms, which resides beyond time, and thus experience the reality of the human soul as the transcendental form of the human personality. Moreover, mythical consciousness was fundamentally pre-perspectival and thus did not yet experience the indeterminacy or diaphaneity of being. As such, mythical awareness was unable to perceive the relationship of freedom within the interaction between the world of forms and the world of nature. The transcendental realm was understood as the unchanging and necessary, in contrast to the natural world's contingency. Thus, the natural world was understood to be dictated by the fate ordained by the transcendental realm. The soul, then, the transcendental dimension of human existence, was experienced as being a kind of fate. The human being was felt to be entirely beholden to the fate of his soul, which was in turn dictated by the will of the gods, which existed beyond time and space. Within integral awareness, we are now able to experience the indeterminacy of the world through meta-perspectivity, and thus see the relationship between the temporal and metatemporal realm as one of concretion, ingression, and involution. We can see that nature is the activity of the transcendental, and this activity is characterized by the achievement of determinacy from possibility. As such, we are able to experience time as such, and thus experience the freedom, which is in fact time itself, what Goethe refers to simply as time freedom. In coming to experience the indeterminacy of the transcendental world of pure form and potentiality, we can thus come to experience our own spiritual constitution in its true multivalency, rather than simply experiencing the world of appearance as the totality of the spiritual as it is seen through the magical structure. We see that we are fundamentally comprised of experiential structures of possibilities, and that the role of our consciousness is in freely navigating those spaces of possibility so as to participate in the creativity of nature. Rather than experiencing our own souls as fates which dictate our existence, we are able to experience the soul as freedom itself. Rather than seeing ourselves as being isolated, atomic ego perspectives, we are able to see that we are in fact the much broader distributions of possibility awareness, which freely concretize into such moments of perspectival, sensory-bound ego consciousness. The boundaries between transcendence and immanence, freedom and determinacy, contingency and necessity give way to an awareness within which these various aspects of reality are seen as disclosures of the harmonious unity which is spirit, which is existence itself. As we saw previously in the artistic manifestations of the transition between unperspectival and perspectival consciousness, art does not show us what is seen by our eyes, but rather what is experienced by spirit. Integral consciousness likewise is also something which we can find given expression within the history of artistic forms. In particular, Goethe saw the emergence of integral aperspectivity within 20th century art movements such as Cubism. Within the Cubist works of Pablo Picasso, we see precisely the multivalency which Goethe saw as fundamental to the ongoing emergence of integral consciousness. Within such works, we do not see the world in an unperspectival view from nowhere, nor do we see it from a particular frame of reference, but rather we see it from a plenitude of such reference frames. We see the object of the artwork as though it were an amalgamation of distinct frames, which have been separated by distinct perspectival viewpoints and then stitched back together by the consciousness of the artist. We see here perspectivity that is aware of its own limitations, but which can nevertheless see the manner in which the world extends beyond the bounds of such limitations. We see not the concrete definiteness of a particular relational structure, but rather a composite of possibilities, which are all seen to be coexistent within the world itself. We see not a world which lies beyond all possible experience, but rather a world comprised of structures of possible experiences which exceed the bounds of any particular sensory apprehension. If we now back up for a moment and look at the broader scheme of this narrative, I think what we find is something very familiar. What we find is the hero's journey. Human consciousness comes to individuate from the Great Mother, the great darkness of indeterminacy and formlessness which underlies nature, and which we felt ourselves to have been born out of. This separation continued as we came to experience ourselves as something distinct from nature, and then came to see nature as a sort of great other, which we were required to control, subvert, or protect ourselves against. As our identification with the Great Mother waned, we came then to instead identify with the Great Father, who represented the transcendental realm. He who was independent of the Great Mother and seemed to wield power over her. We came to wield powers of technology, fire, and architecture, which we believed to be of this transcendental fatherly realm which stood over and above the writhing, chthonic darkness of Mother Nature or Mother Ocean. In submitting ourselves to the tutelage of the Father, we came to wield his powers, which then allowed us to seemingly transcend our own interdependency upon the Great Mother. We came to conceptualize ourselves as having been cast down from a higher realm, rather than having risen up from the darkness of the primordial womb. In doing so, we achieved a sense of self-identity and self-perspective, which afforded us immense power to reshape the world. And yet this separation left us atomized, isolated, and alienated from the world which we, in spite of all, still inextricably found ourselves to be within and to be a part of. The next stage, then, is reintegration. We are required to step outside of the atomized ego selfhood which we fashioned in our journey towards independence. In doing so, we come to reintegrate the individual souls which have come to develop with the darkness with which we remain intimately connected, the ever-present origin of all things which has been with us and within us all along. The formless indeterminacy which is in fact the key to the very freedom which we have sought out, fought and died for over the course of tens of thousands of years. The diaphaneity of which Gebser speaks, the inexhaustible depths of being of which Heidegger speaks, and the inextricable indeterminacy of time of which Whitehead speaks, are in fact all but different valences of the same formlessness within form. The same indeterminacy of determination, the same freedom which is our fate. Our coming to awareness of this fated freedom is the transmutation of fate into destiny, a destiny which is our own will unto being, which is one and the same will unto being which generates reality. Before bringing this to a close, I want to look at an example which I believe to be perfectly illustrative of integral awareness. Not in terms of theory or metaphysics per se, but rather in terms of direct experiencing. The immediate coming to presence of the diaphanous transparency of truth which Gebser spoke of. Here we will be looking at the German biologist and philosopher of science Johann von Goethe. In an incident which has since become legendary among Goethe's followers, Goethe made the acquaintance of Friedrich Schiller at a conference of the Society of Nature Research in Jena, resulting in a very intense conversation on the nature of life and the study of biology. The conversation continued at Schiller's residence, wherein Goethe took up a pen to physically illustrate something which he had come to call the Urpflanz, the archetypal plant, which Goethe believed to be a sort of primordial form which preconditioned all plant life. Goethe insisted to Schiller that this archetypal plant was something which he actually saw in plants, not an abstract theory. Upon seeing this illustration, Schiller was not convinced, stating, quote, "That is not an observation from experience. That is an idea." To which Goethe replied, quote, "Then I may rejoice that I have ideas without knowing it, and can even see them with my own eyes." What we see here is what Goethe claimed to see. What appears to be an amalgamation of all the basic possibilities within different varieties of flora. Indeed, this Urpflanz was not merely an idea which Goethe had developed to explain the world, but rather it is an archetypal form which lies within the heart of all plant life. A diffuse structure of possibilities which we see instantiated within the vast array of distinct plant species. One could say that it is the aura or etheric body which is common to all plants, the possibility space felt by nature itself and navigated in the evolution of the various plant species. Goethe saw that all of the distinct morphological characteristics of plants were in fact elaborations upon a single underlying form, namely the leaf. The leaf is the core archetypal morpheme of plant life, and thus all plant morphology comes about as a navigation of the possibility space which extends outward from that common core. In Goethe's image of the Urpflanz, we see this radiation of possibility which develops from the underlying morpheme. Goethe was adamant that this image was not something which he conceived, but rather something which he saw, which he experienced directly by close observation of plants themselves, not by abstract theorizing. This experience was a remarkable and brilliant spark of integral awareness, awareness which brings to presence not only that which is available to the senses, but which recognizes the diaphanous distributions of potentialities which give rise to the sensory. It is not merely a cognizing of form, but moreover, it is an experiencing of the indeterminate and participatory relationships between the possible and the actual, the transcendent and the immanent, the sensory and the suprasensory. It is experience which resides within time, but which also extends beyond time, into the realm of the eternal. Goethe's ability to experience the underlying archetypal structures of plant morphology and the archetypal dynamics of light, shadow, and color are but one manner in which integral awareness may come to manifest, and he is by no means the only such figure we could look to as an example of this metamorphosis of consciousness. Yet in Goethe we see a pronounced foreshadowing of transformations which continue to germinate within our collective consciousness. Goethe and his contemporaries within the German idealism movement represent, I believe, the first unfoldings of integral consciousness, though this process of unfolding is one which has continued and still yet continues to unfold some 2.5 centuries later. The titans of the German idealism movement, such as Goethe, Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin, lived during a period which stretched from the closing decades of the 18th century to the first half of the 19th century. During this time, the world saw the birth of liberal democracy, the American and French revolutions, and the discovery of electricity. Yet one event within this time period stands above all others in terms of archetypal significance and our understanding of the transformations of human consciousness: the discovery of the planet Uranus in 1781. As we discussed in my previous video, the apex of the axial age corresponded to a triple conjunction of the outer planets: Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, the only such triple conjunction in all of known human history, and yet during this time, humanity remained unaware of the planets which lay beyond what could be seen with the unaided human eye. Some 2,000 years later, the Copernican revolution would mirror the developing perspectivity of human consciousness by placing at the center of our solar system the Sun, a celestial body which archetypally signifies the destiny and individuality of the human soul. In doing so, this revolution drastically transformed the astronomical paradigm, which had previously mirrored the Neoplatonic metaphysical paradigm which underpinned the Western mind's understanding of the cosmos it found itself within. In 1781, this traditional paradigm seemed to be shattered beyond repair with the discovery of a planet which lay beyond what could have possibly been known to ancient astrologers and cosmologists. Yet, in the ensuing 2.5 centuries, astrologers have come to associate the outer planets with archetypal modalities which seem to correspond perfectly with their remoteness within the vast darkness beyond the reach of our sensory organs. Uranus is the planet of unrest, rupture, revolution, and radical transformation. Neptune, the planet of oceanic, spiritual oneness, fantasies, illusions, and ideals. Pluto is the planet of anxiety, fear, and the primal will to life and death which emerges from such tensions. Just as Goethe came to see the invisible through looking at the world with his mind, so too did William Herschel come to see for the first time the celestial bodies which resided beyond what our sensory organs can perceive. Just as Hegel came to see history not as a continuously repeating cycle, but rather a titanic process driven by forces which shaped the evolution of civilization, so too did astrologers come to see in Uranus an indication of processes which shape our world over the course of ages rather than decades. As I indicated previously, it seems to me that in many ways integral consciousness amounts to a capacity to see the formless, indeterminate darkness which lies within the transcendental world of form. The discovery of the outer planets seems to correspond precisely to such an awakening, in which we come to see the chthonic forces which reside within the celestial realm. It is within those dangerous, destructive, and primordial powers that we are to find the possibilities of freedom which we are destining ourselves towards. Integral consciousness is something which we could identify within innumerable examples drawn from art, film, philosophy, science, theology, music, and architecture from our present era as well as from across the entire breadth of the past 250 years. It is not something which certain gurus have obtained which sets them apart from the ignorant masses. but rather the realization of this achievement is a project within which we are all co-participants. This development is, however, both necessary and pivotal with regards to human freedom, and thus also with the moral realization of the human journey. In that regard, we do find that the realization of the integral through the freeing of human life from the mechanistic bindings of the deficient rational structure is itself an endeavor of moral obligation. In such an endeavor, Gebser tells us that we will come to realize a true technology of true human liberation from the false prophecies of mechanical enframing. Ultimately, Gebser understands the integral structure to be a mode of consciousness in which the polarity or duality of transcendence and immanence comes to be surpassed by what is in essence an awareness of spirit, that which achieves concretion of form through the negation of its own formlessness, that which is diaphanous and originary. Within such awareness, we achieve an ego-free mode of being, not through the annihilation of the ego, but rather through escaping the confines and shackles imposed by the ego, through our awareness of the totality of our own being, of which the ego is but an aspect. We come to an awareness of and identification with the whole, which ego perspectivity had previously concealed from us. We set ourselves free from the ego by freeing the ego from itself. In doing so, we come to experience time, freedom, and spirit in the ultimacy of their true nature, by seeing that those words are in fact aspects of one and the same totality, the ever-present origin. Here we will come to a close with some of Gebser's own final remarks on the landscape which we find now before us. Quote, "Once man sought truth. This was achieved over the millennia by philosophy. Once man believed truth, and this bond was made possible over the millennia by religion. Wherever we think and believe, those attainments endure. But for those capable of awaring the whole, the true, this verition is no longer a philosophical search nor a faith beset by doubts, but a discovery beyond that search, which throughout the ages was merely the preparation. The undivided, ego-free person who no longer sees parts, but realizes the itself, the spiritual form of the being of man and the world, perceives the whole. What is before space and time becomes perceptible in conscious achronicity. The pretemporal becomes time freedom, vacuity becomes plenitude, and in transparency, the spiritual comes to perception. Origin is present. Within truth, we come to an awaring of the whole, and the whole comes to an awaring of us."